He expected deference, not truth, until a quiet server slipped him a note and shattered his illusion. Watch the moment a single act of courage drags a king from his throne. Jameson Blackwood entered the Gilded Steer as himself, not hidden behind second-hand jackets or thrift store glasses, but in a tailored charcoal suit that had been cut to his frame by a Milanese craftsman, a suit that whispered money and demanded attention without a word. He did not walk quickly, but every step was measured, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor with a rhythm that made the room pause. The hostess looked up, her trained smile sharpening when she recognized him, though the recognition carried more fear than warmth. He did not offer his name, did not pretend humility, but simply said in a low, firm tone that he wanted the emperor's cut, and he wanted it in a private room, a command rather than a request, and the air shifted. The diners in silk dresses and dark suits glanced his way, curiosity sparking in their eyes, but none dared approach. The staff moved faster, sharper, as if the weight of his demand had tilted the whole room into orbit around him. Jameson watched it all with the detachment of a scientist studying a specimen. He saw how a junior waiter almost tripped rushing to clear a path to the private chamber, how the sommelier abandoned another table mid, sentenced to fetch the right glassware, how even the manager's shoulders stiffened as he straightened his tie and hurried over to offer greetings. Jameson allowed it, offered nothing in return, his face unreadable. When the manager stammered a welcome, Jameson cut him short with a glance and a reminder that his meal and his privacy were the only things he cared for. The man nodded, flustered, retreating with a bow that looked rehearsed and hollow. Jameson sat at the head of a long table in a room built for 10, the firelight painting gold on the wood paneling, and he asked for silence until his meal arrived. The room obeyed. He could feel the mechanics of wealth at work, the invisible levers that bent people toward him, not out of respect, not out of affection, but out of fear and the intoxicating pull of proximity to power. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, and let the orchestra play. A busboy wiped down a table twice, though it was already clean, just to be seen working hard in his presence. A hostess peeked through the glass door, her face pale with awe. The chef himself appeared for a moment at the threshold, as if to make sure the steak would meet an impossible standard. Jameson had asked for royal treatment, and the house had turned itself inside out to deliver. Yet none of it felt like service, only performance. He knew the emperor's cut would arrive glistening, tender and flawless, yet that was not what he was here to taste. He was tasting the culture, tasting the way his empire responded when power walked in unmasked. Every gesture, every anxious smile, every bow revealed more than financial reports ever could. The room tilted toward him, but it was not gravity, he felt. It was loneliness. He raised his glass, watching the reflection of his own eyes, and wondered whether anyone in this house would ever dare tell him the truth. The moment Jameson made his demand, the restaurant changed shape, as if an unseen conductor had lifted a baton and struck the first note of a symphony. The hostess, who had been glancing lazily at her tablet, suddenly straightened her spine and summoned a brightness in her smile that had not been there a breath before. The junior waiters, who had been joking softly near the kitchen doors, snapped into rigid lines of efficiency, their trays steadier, their movements faster, every gesture sharpened by the awareness that the owner himself was in their midst, and he had asked for royal treatment. Even the bar seemed to hum louder, bottles clinking as the bartender rearranged them with unnecessary flourish, eager to be noticed in the halo of power that had descended upon the room. It was as if every corner of the Gilded Steer had been lit by the same fire, and that fire was fear disguised as devotion. Jameson saw it and said nothing, letting the spectacle play out, while the manager Dale Mercer hurried across the floor with a grin that strained against his own vanity. Dale's suit was tailored but cheap at the seams, his watch polished but not precious. Yet he carried himself like a man convinced of his importance, and the sight of Jameson gave him the chance to perform. He clapped his hands once, snapped at a busboy to move faster, then reached the private door with a bow that looked practiced in the mirror more times than genuine courtesy could allow. "Yes, sir, of course, sir, whatever you need, sir." The words rolled off his tongue with oil-slick smoothness, and Jameson nodded, cool and silent, knowing exactly what kind of man Dale was. At the far edge of the dining room, Mara watched it unfold. She had been serving table 9, a quiet couple sharing a modest bottle of house red, when the shift in the air caught her attention. It was not admiration she saw bloom across the faces of her co-workers. It was calculation, a performance rehearsed so well they no longer noticed they were acting. Every yes they spoke was a currency, each smile a wager placed on the chance of a tip, a promotion, or simply survival under Dale's hawk eyes. Mara was young, but not naive. Her years of service had taught her the difference between kindness offered freely and kindness offered for gain, and what she saw now was the latter, a hollow devotion that rang false in her ears. She carried a tray past Jameson's door and caught a glimpse of him seated alone, his presence quiet but immense, and though she did not know his thoughts, she sensed he was watching as she was, both of them measuring the honesty of the room and finding it lacking. The Emperor's cut would arrive soon, the wine would pour, the staff would bow lower still, yet none of it was for the love of the craft or the dignity of service. It was the wrong kind of yes, the yes born of fear and greed, and Mara felt the weight of it pressing against her chest as if the whole house were leaning toward a single man because his wallet was heavier than their truth. Arthur Pendleton's voice carried the weight of caution even through the phone, each word precise and deliberate as he explained the new initiative that had begun to creep across the hospitality division. He called it the VIP Assurance Program, a package of perks and untraceable courtesies that promised the wealthiest guests an experience beyond the already extravagant standards of the Gilded Steer. On paper, it sounded like a clever marketing tool, a way to secure loyalty from those who lived for privilege, but in practice the numbers were swelling in ways that made Arthur uneasy. He had spent decades keeping Blackwood Holdings lean and disciplined, and he knew when something smelled of excess. The monthly costs had ballooned far beyond the budgeted margins, and though the revenue reports were still impressive, the ratio between profit and expense was slipping in the wrong direction. Jameson listened quietly, his face unreadable as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the silence stretching long enough to make Arthur clear his throat and repeat himself. Jameson finally replied that reports and ratios could only tell part of the truth, that culture was a more dangerous currency than money when it went unchecked, and he had seen enough of both to know when something was rotting at the root. If staff were being trained to bend rules, to throw standards aside in the name of appeasing select guests, then the entire chain of trust that his empire had been built upon would erode. He did not build his fortune by selling mere food and service. He sold the promise of integrity wrapped in luxury, and if that promise cracked, then everything else would crumble. Arthur, ever the cautious anchor, suggested dispatching a quiet audit team, accountants who could move through the books without raising alarm, but Jameson shook his head. Numbers were pliable, numbers could be disguised, and the people who learned to twist numbers often learned to twist faces as well. He needed more than an audit of paper. He needed an audit of spirit, and the only way to uncover that was to step directly into the storm. He told Arthur that tonight he would not wear disguise. He would not skulk in the corners as Jim from the thrift store. He would stand tall as Jameson Blackwood and demand the kind of treatment the program promised. If the staff had been conditioned to worship money, then let them worship him. And in their eagerness, he would measure the truth of their loyalties. Arthur sighed, warning him of the risks, reminding him that visibility meant vulnerability. But Jameson dismissed the concern with the cool certainty of a man who had survived markets far harsher than dining rooms. The culture of his house was worth more than a quarterly report, and if it was slipping into hollow ritual, he wanted to see the cracks with his own eyes. He ended the call and set the glass aside, his reflection in the window sharp against the Chicago skyline. A man about to measure the worth of honesty in a kingdom that had learned to say yes too easily. Mara balanced the tray on one hand with the kind of steady grace that came only from years of practice, her movements unhurried even as the restaurant around her buzzed with nervous energy. The moment Jameson Blackwood had asked for the Emperor's cut and a private room, the floor had turned frantic, staff darting like anxious birds, each one desperate to be noticed, each one terrified of making the smallest mistake. She watched it all with quiet detachment, her brown eyes sharp as glass, noting how every smile carried a little too much brightness, and every compliment sounded like it had been rehearsed in the mirror. To Mara, it was theater, and though she played her part, she never forgot that it was all a play. She had seen this dance too many times before, guests with thick wallets walking in like kings, staff bending themselves into impossible shapes to keep them pleased, and always the same hollow gratitude echoing through the air like a chorus of well-trained parrots. When she stepped into the private room, the firelight flickered across Jameson's face, his expression calm and unreadable, his presence heavy without effort. She set down the wine glass, her hands steady, and asked in her even voice whether he would like the first pour. He nodded, offering no small talk, and she sensed immediately that he was watching not only her, but the entire room, taking in the little details that most guests never noticed. Mara was used to eyes on her, used to being judged by her uniform and her smile. But his gaze felt different, not leering, not dismissive, but measuring, as if he were looking for something beneath the surface. She poured with care, the crimson liquid catching the glow of the fire, and placed the bottle back on the table without a sound. Outside the private room, she caught the ripple effect of his presence again. A couple who had been seated comfortably near the window were quietly relocated to a cramped table by the kitchen, their protests hushed with free dessert menus, all to clear space for another wealthy group that might spend more. A family celebrating a birthday was hurried along, their plates whisked away before they were finished, so the tablecloth could be reset in pristine folds for a lawyer and his clients. It was the kind of cruelty that passed for efficiency in a house like this, invisible to those who benefited, but glaringly obvious to those shoved aside. Mara carried another tray past them and saw the mother's disappointed eyes as the birthday cake vanished too quickly, and her jaw tightened, though she said nothing. Returning to Jameson's table, she kept her tone steady, asking whether he wished the steak with truffle reduction or foie gras, and when he answered, she simply nodded, offering no excess charm. The others might flood him with compliments, but she gave him only service, professional and clear. Inside, she felt the tremor of injustice, but outside she was steel, her calm the armor she wore each night. Around her the room bent and twisted for power, but Mara remained straight, quietly recording every shove, every false yes, every smile that hid a bruise on dignity. The memory of Gregory Finch still haunted the Gilded Steer, whispered in back rooms and carried in the nervous glances of the older staff who remembered his reign. He had been taken away in disgrace, but the shadow he left behind clung to the walls like smoke. Mara had seen how quickly people adjusted, how fear shifted from one figure to another, and how silence became a habit no one dared break. Finch was gone, Yet his methods had not been buried with him. They had been polished, repackaged, and returned in the form of Dale Mercer, a man who wore a slick smile the way other men wore armor. Dale was younger, hungrier, his hair always too perfectly arranged, his cufflinks gleaming as if to prove that he was more than just another middle manager. But Mara knew the truth. She had eyes for the small details, and she saw the way envelopes moved into his pocket, the way certain vendors earned his warmth while others were frozen out, the way he spoke of the VIP assurance program as if it were a kingdom and he the gatekeeper. She had heard the staff mutter that Dale ran the program like a toll booth. If you wanted access, if you wanted your product on the menu or your wine in the cellar, you had to pay. He dressed it up in corporate language, calling it a partnership fee or a premium for priority placement. But everyone who touched it understood what it was. Kickbacks, plain and simple. Mara had been in the office once when he thought she was invisible, balancing invoices late at night, and she saw the slip of cash tucked beneath the ledger. He noticed her glance, and his smile sharpened in warning. She kept her head down and walked away, but she did not forget. Dale's charm was smooth enough to fool guests, and perhaps even Arthur Pendleton from a distance, but Mara could feel the same rot that Finch had left behind, only this time coated in silk. Jameson, seated in his private room, could not hear the whispers, but Mara suspected he could sense the undercurrent. She carried plates in silence, but when their eyes met for a flicker of a second, she felt the question in his gaze. It was not curiosity about the steak or the wine. It was the deeper kind, the kind that asked what the house was hiding. She gave him nothing aloud, but in the steadiness of her service, in the quiet refusal to bow to Dale's theatrics, she hinted at the truth. The staff around her poured on their false sweetness, telling Jameson everything he wanted to hear, but Mara's measured calm was its own signal, a contrast sharp enough to be noticed. Finch's shadow lingered, and Dale had built his throne in it, but Mara knew that power built on fear and kickbacks was fragile. One honest glance, one brave word could topple it. Until then, she carried her tray like a shield and kept her secrets close, waiting for the moment the house of cards would shake. Jameson leaned back in his chair, the glow of the fire settling across the polished table, and let silence stretch long enough to make the staff uneasy. Then he asked for something that was not on the menu. A dish he described in vague but deliberate detail, the kind of request that would test whether the house had integrity or whether it would break its own rules to please him. He wanted a cut of beef prepared with a truffle glaze not listed anywhere, and he wanted it rushed. The sommelier blinked, hesitated, then smiled too quickly, saying, "Of course, sir, anything you like," before hurrying off to bend the kitchen into shapes it was never meant to hold. Jameson's eyes followed him, calm and cold, noting the speed with which boundaries collapsed when money pressed against them. Minutes later, the manager Dale appeared, his grin polished, assuring Jameson that the chef would personally craft the special dish, though Jameson knew by the tightness in his voice that he had just ordered corners to be cut. Rules about menu integrity, supply chain tracking, and cost accounting would be pushed aside to keep a single guest pleased, and Dale wore his compromise like a badge of pride. Jameson asked then for a tour of the kitchen, not during closing, not at a safe scheduled hour, but now, in the middle of service when the machine was running at full tilt. Dale froze for half a second, then forced a laugh, saying it would be his honor. Mara, standing nearby with her tray, caught the flicker in his eyes. He was calculating what could be hidden, what could be disguised, and how fast it could be done. As they walked through the swinging doors, the temperature rose, the smell of searing meat and garlic wrapping around them. The chef bowed too low, wiping sweat from his brow, and barked an order at a line cook who nearly dropped a pan. Jameson stepped past Dale and let his gaze sweep the counters, noting the rush, the shortcuts, the small violations that came from being told to deliver the impossible. Gloves slipped from hands, timers were ignored, and a sauce was pulled early just to keep the rhythm moving. He asked questions in a calm tone: where the meat had come from, why the storage log was unsigned, why a tray meant for tomorrow was already thawing on the counter. Every answer was smoothed with politeness, but every answer carried the edge of fear. Dale's smile never wavered, though sweat beaded near his temples, and Jameson marked the distance between the words spoken and the truth underneath. Back at the table, the special dish arrived too quickly, plated with elegance but betraying the rush in its uneven sear. Jameson tasted it once and set down his fork, not in anger but in quiet disappointment. Around him, the staff waited, breath held, their deference heavy enough to choke the room. He saw clearly what Arthur's reports could never show. Deference had a price, and tonight he had watched integrity sold cheap, traded away for the illusion of pleasing power. The meal had ended in silence, the remnants of the rushed dish cooling on a plate that Jameson had touched only once, his expression giving away nothing. The staff hovered at a polite distance, waiting for the smallest sign of approval, but he offered none. He sat with his glass of wine, letting the minutes stretch when the door to the private room opened just enough to let in a man he had not seen before. He was not staff, at least not in uniform, but he moved with the confidence of someone who belonged. Without a word, he placed a velvet envelope on the table and left as quietly as he had come, the door clicking shut behind him. Jameson glanced at it, the deep red fabric catching the firelight, and felt the room tilt a fraction. Stamped across the front in embossed gold letters were the words VIP, confidential. He slid a finger under the flap and pulled out a single card, the weight of it thick and deliberate. On it were 7 words written in sharp black ink: "Play along, or the footage goes live." His jaw tightened. The meaning was immediate and dangerous. Someone was watching. Someone had been recording his demands, his off, menu orders, his request for a kitchen tour, every test he had set to measure the culture. Taken out of context, those actions could be spun into arrogance, scandal, or worse, a narrative of hypocrisy that would cut through his empire like a knife. He set the card down and let his face remain calm, though his pulse had quickened. Cameras, he thought, hidden not by the house but by an intruder who knew exactly where to aim. His eyes scanned the corners of the room, the light fixtures, the small vent above the door. If the game was blackmail, then it was being played with precision. The envelope itself was bait, meant to rattle him, meant to push him into panic. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, folding the card once between his fingers, and replayed every moment in his mind. Who had been close enough to watch? Who had a reason to turn hospitality into leverage? Who was bold enough to treat him as prey? Mara entered with a tray to clear the plates, her calm eyes flicking to the envelope for only a second, then back to her task. She said nothing, but Jameson caught the faint tightening of her jaw, a sign that she too understood something was wrong. He gave her a nod, subtle, enough to let her know he had seen the message, enough to assure her that he was not afraid. She left without a word, her movements smooth, but he felt the air shift as though an invisible line had been drawn in the sand. The velvet envelope lay on the table like a silent threat, its weight far heavier than paper. Jameson knew one thing with cold certainty: the game had changed. He was not merely testing his house anymore, he was being tested in return. And somewhere in the shadows, a lens was watching his every move, ready to turn deference into destruction. The velvet envelope still sat on the table, a silent weight heavier than gold, when Jameson noticed how the dining room beyond the glass wall had shifted. Conversations that once bubbled with easy laughter now carried a hushed undercurrent. Heads turned a fraction too often toward his private room, and more than one phone glimmered with the faint light of a camera discreetly raised. He understood then that the threat was not idle, that eyes and lenses were already fixed on him, waiting for a slip, a show of weakness, or an outburst to capture and twist. He remained perfectly still, the mask of power steady on his face, though beneath it his mind raced with cold precision. He could not afford to look hunted, not here, not in front of staff trained to bow and smile, not in front of guests who smelled scandal like perfume. The door opened softly, and Mara entered, her tray empty, her steps unhurried. She carried only her calm, and it was that calm that drew the gaze of the entire room, though none could name why. Jameson watched her approach, every gesture precise, her shoulders square, her face composed. And in that composure he read resolve. She set a folded napkin on the table as though she were delivering cutlery, then leaned slightly closer, her voice carrying just enough to reach him, yet steady enough to sound natural. "Sir, your employee badge is ready." The words struck like a stone against glass. For a second, the hum of the room seemed to falter, and Jameson felt the subtle tilt of expectation press down on him. Mara reached into the pocket of her apron and slid a plain lanyard across the polished wood. A plastic badge attached with nothing more than his name, handwritten in neat black ink. To anyone watching it was an odd joke, a harmless trinket, but he saw the truth immediately. It was code, a shield, and an invitation all at once. By calling him employee, she stripped away the armor of wealth, gave him a cover story against the cameras, and offered him a way to step out of the gilded cage without drawing suspicion. Jameson picked up the badge, turned it between his fingers, and allowed the smallest flicker of amusement to cross his face, playing his part in the performance. If anyone was recording, they would see a billionaire indulging in a novelty gesture from a bold waitress, not a man receiving a warning smuggled through courage. He placed the lanyard around his neck, the plastic tag resting against the fabric of his suit, and felt the strange relief of camouflage. Mara straightened, her eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second, a silent message passing between them. "Danger is here. Come with me." She gathered the unused wine glass, bowed her head politely, and stepped back toward the door. Jameson rose a moment later, the badge visible against his chest, and followed. The dining room leaned in, curious, amused, thinking perhaps it was a stunt, but for Jameson the word still echoed in his mind, sharper than any threat written on velvet. Employee. It was his shield, his signal, and the key to the shadowed corridors waiting beyond the light. Jameson walked behind Mara with the lanyard hanging from his neck, the plastic badge swinging lightly against his suit as if mocking the weight of the empire it covered. The dining room seemed to hum louder, laughter pitched too high, glasses clinking in rhythms too sharp, every sound edged with the static of attention. He kept his steps measured, but inside he felt the cold creep into his chest. When the door closed behind them and the hum of the dining room faded, Mara turned slightly, her voice low, her tone stripped of pretense. "They are recording you," she said, "and if you react wrong, it will be on 10 screens before dessert." Jameson did not answer right away. His eyes narrowed, his breath shallow, and for the first time in years a chill crawled down his spine. The velvet envelope made sense now, the strange courier, the hushed phones raised at just the right angles. This was no accident of gossip, no ordinary guest snapping a picture for a story to tell later. It was a trap, deliberate and calculated, designed to twist perception into scandal. The scheme was brilliant in its cruelty. They built a ring not of thieves but of spectators, a blackmail machine that lived off the hunger of reputation. They baited powerful men into bending rules, offering them off-menu luxuries, closed tours, privileges denied to others, and the moment the lines blurred, a camera caught it. Then came the velvet envelope, the quiet demand, play along, or the footage goes live. The videos would not need to show guilt, only arrogance, only indulgence, only the smallest crack in dignity, and the rest the public would fill with outrage. Jameson felt the blood drain from his face, not from fear for himself, but for what it meant to the empire he had built. His brand was more than restaurants and towers. It was a promise that wealth could carry honor, that luxury could coexist with integrity. If a video surfaced of him breaking rules, even in a test, it would stain that promise, and no amount of denial could wash it clean. He imagined the headlines: "Billionaire demands special treatment, hypocrisy and hospitality giant," and he saw investors pulling back, partnerships freezing, staff ashamed to wear the uniform. The trap was not aimed at his money, it was aimed at his name, and that made it far deadlier. Mara watched him carefully, her own face calm, though her hands tightened on the tray she still carried. She had seen others caught in the same snare. Vendors who lost contracts when their private indulgences were leaked, guests who paid heavily for silence that only lasted until the next demand. She told him in a whisper that Dale ran the program like a stage, feeding the ring with footage while pretending it was all about VIP loyalty. Jameson's eyes hardened, the pale mask of realization settling across him. For years he had searched for honesty by stepping into shadows, but now the shadows had turned on him, twisting his test into a weapon. He stood still for a long moment, then adjusted the badge around his neck. The game had shifted, and survival now meant playing it with colder precision than those who thought they owned the camera. The badge felt foreign against his chest, light in weight but heavy in meaning, and Jameson kept one hand near it as if to remind himself of the role he now played. Employee, the word echoed in his mind, not as insult, but as disguise, a shield crafted by a waitress with nerves of steel. Mara walked ahead of him with steady strides, pushing open a door that led away from the velvet and brass of the dining room into the narrow corridors of the service wing. The air changed immediately. The polished perfume of the restaurant gave way to the sharp bite of bleach, frying oil, and the damp chill of storage rooms stacked with crates. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, throwing everything into a harsh glow that stripped away illusion. Jameson slowed his pace, taking in every detail. Here the house revealed its true veins, the arteries of work that kept the glamour alive. Carts rattled by, pushed by unseen hands. Dishwashers shouted over the clatter of plates. Line cooks slipped through swinging doors, balancing trays that looked heavier than their paychecks. No one bowed here. No one pretended charm. They were too tired, too busy, too focused on keeping the machine moving. Jameson, who had been treated like a king minutes earlier, passed unnoticed now, just another body wearing a lanyard, and he felt a strange relief in the invisibility. Mara glanced back only once, her expression calm, but her eyes carried a message that told him to keep silent and watch. So he did. He noticed how corners bent in places the reports never revealed. A box of wine stacked high bore a label from a supplier he did not recognize, its edges water-stained, as if stored too long. A prep cook pulled thawed meat from a container marked for tomorrow's menu, slipping it onto today's line without logging the change. A janitor swept past, his broom worn to half its bristles, ignored by everyone though his labor was what kept the house from collapsing into grime. The hum of the staff corridors was different from the hum of the dining room. Out there, every sound was staged, laughter measured, music curated to match the sparkle of crystal. In here, the sound was raw, honest, alive with the strain of real effort. Jameson felt each note press against him, not as a performance but as truth. And for a moment he wondered how many years he had let pass without listening to this music. He followed Mara through another door and into the staff break room, a cramped space with a single humming refrigerator, coffee burnt dark in a pot, and tired shoes stretched out under chairs. A calendar on the wall carried notes scribbled in different hands, requests for shift swaps, reminders of bills due, a silent map of lives running on fumes. Mara stopped, turned to him, and spoke in a low voice meant only for his ears. "This is the house behind the house," she said, "the part you never see when you sit with the wine list." He nodded, his face unreadable, though inside he felt something shift. Here, in the veins of the building, stripped of linen and glass, he had finally seen the truth of what his empire cost. The staff room smelled of burnt coffee and tired bodies, the hum of the vending machine filling the silence, until Mara leaned closer and spoke in a tone that was both steady and heavy. She told Jameson that what he had seen so far was only the surface, that the velvet envelope and the quiet threats were pieces of something far larger, something that had been growing since Finch was forced out and Dale Mercer slid into his place. Jameson stayed silent, his eyes fixed on her face, letting her carry the words without interruption. She explained that the VIP assurance program was not only a drain on budgets, but a shell that hid rivers of stolen money. Every week she watched bills that should have been closed and paid rerouted into the program, marked as complimentary perks for high-tier guests, the amounts written off the books so neatly that auditors reading later would see nothing but generosity. In truth, the meals were paid for by ordinary patrons whose tips shrank and whose wages were stretched thin, while Dale kept the illusion of flawless service for his chosen few. Mara's voice dropped lower as she described the overtime sheets, how staff who worked 12-hour shifts saw only 8 hours written down, their missing wages erased under the claim of VIP courtesy service. The numbers balanced perfectly on paper, but the balance came from their backs, their rent unpaid, their debts growing. Jameson felt the cold knot in his stomach tighten, though his face gave nothing away. He had built an empire promising dignity in labor, yet here dignity was being stolen hour by hour, hidden behind smiles and polished plates. He asked no questions, only nodded once, signaling for her to continue. Her eyes flicked toward the corner as if the walls themselves might be listening. Then she told him about the cash. Every Saturday night, after close, Dale made his rounds with a smile that fooled no one. The wine locker near the back, meant for the most expensive vintages, carried more than bottles. Behind the stacked crates of Bordeaux sat envelopes, thick and plain, delivered by certain vendors who never signed in and never left receipts. She had seen them more than once, slid across the polished wood and tucked under Dale's arm, as if they were no more suspicious than menus. At first she thought it was a single favor, a one-time deal, but it became a ritual as precise as the resetting of tables. By the time dawn touched the city, the cash would be inside Dale's briefcase, and by Monday morning the locker would be empty, its secret hidden again. Jameson listened, his fingers resting against the edge of the table, his pulse steady though inside his anger burned. He had suspected rot, but hearing it in Mara's calm voice, seeing the bravery it took for her to say it, turned suspicion into certainty. The ledger behind Dale's smile was written not in ink, but in stolen hours, and comped bills and cash that smelled of betrayal. Jameson knew then that what he held was not only an empire to protect, but a duty to the people who kept it alive. People like Mara, who had chosen to risk everything for the truth. Jameson sat in the cramped staff room long after Mara had finished speaking, his hands folded, his mind sharpening into the cold focus that had built his empire from nothing. He knew numbers, he knew leverage, but what Mara had given him was a story written in flesh and fear, a story that could topple the house if exposed the right way. His phone buzzed once on the table, the faint vibration breaking the heavy silence. He picked it up and read Arthur's message, only 3 words but enough to shift the ground beneath his feet. Ghost, inbound. Jameson exhaled slowly, the tension in his jaw softening. Arthur had moved quickly, reaching into the quiet network they never spoke of outside emergencies. If Arthur called her ghost, then Jameson knew exactly who was coming. Minutes later, the back entrance creaked open, and a cart rolled in, its squeaky wheel masking the silence of the figure who pushed it. Wren looked exactly as he remembered. Sharp lines in her face, eyes like cut steel, every movement deliberate and without waste. She wore the gray uniform of Sparkle Clean, the kind of outfit that made most people invisible, and pushed a cart stacked with mops, rags, and bottles of cleaner. To the casual eye, she was a night worker entering on schedule. Nothing more. To Jameson, she was a blade wrapped in cloth. She offered no greeting, only a glance, and went straight to work. Within minutes, she had looped a discreet camera hidden near the ceiling vent, her fingers moving with such ease it seemed like second nature. The feed that had been watching the staff room would now replay the same empty frame again and again, a seamless loop for anyone spying. From the pocket of her uniform, she pulled a device no larger than a paperclip, its surface dull so it caught no light, and pressed it beneath the desk where Dale often sat. A faint click signaled it was live, a recorder small enough to be forgotten, sharp enough to capture every word whispered in the room. Jameson watched her work with quiet respect. Wren was not dramatic, not theatrical, but efficient, every action like a scalpel cut, precise and controlled. Mara stood by the doorway, uncertain, her eyes darting between Jameson and the stranger moving through the room like a shadow. Jameson gave her a slight nod, an unspoken assurance that this was an ally, not another predator. Wren ignored the tension, sliding open her cart to reveal another layer beneath the cleaning rags. Inside were coils of wire, a thin laptop, and tools too sophisticated for janitorial duty. She worked quickly, her hands steady, setting small sensors in corners, seeding the room until it was no longer Dale's safe ground, but a stage wired for truth. When she finished, she closed the cart, wiped her hands on a rag, and finally spoke in her low, clipped voice. "Now we wait." Jameson leaned back, the weight in his chest easing slightly. The blackmail ring thought they owned the cameras, thought they held the story, but now he had his own ghost in the house. For the first time that night, he felt the balance tilt, and he welcomed the shift with a cold, steady calm. Jameson returned to the private room with the mask of the billionaire firmly in place, his lanyard hidden beneath his suit jacket, but the weight of it still resting against his chest. He leaned back in the chair, as though nothing in the world troubled him, waving for another glass of wine with the casual arrogance expected of a man demanding deference. The dining room beyond the glass wall stirred at every movement he made, whispers rising, eyes darting to catch a glimpse of him lifting the crystal to his lips. It was all part of the show, and Jameson played it well, knowing that the cameras wanted excess and vanity. He gave them both while keeping his mind fixed on the other half of the plan unfolding in the shadows. Mara moved through the floor like a dancer, her tray balanced with perfect poise, her voice warm but measured, her smile never slipping into the brittle sharpness worn by her colleagues. To the guests, she was simply the best waitress in the house, attentive without being overbearing, graceful without a hint of strain. But every step she took was part of a larger ballet, one designed not just to serve meals, but to buy time and cover the quiet extraction that would pierce through Dale's empire of deceit. She delivered entrees to one table, leaned just enough to reset silverware at another, and with the turn of her wrist slipped her phone from her apron to capture a photo of a comp slip left unattended on the host's podium. The slip bore the bold stamp of VIP assurance, the numbers erased from the bill, the cost shuffled into the invisible column Arthur had warned Jameson about. When she reached the wine station, her hands moved with practiced elegance, lifting a bottle for one guest while her phone camera clicked discreetly against the reflection of the ledger Dale had left open. Timestamps marked overtime erased, staff names crossed out, hours stolen. She did not linger, did not draw attention, only tucked the phone back into her apron with the same calm as if she were folding a napkin. The ballet continued. She brushed past the locker in the back corridor, her smile steady for the busboy she passed, and with her other hand slid the phone against the wood, capturing an image of plain envelopes stacked where vintage bottles should have been, names scrawled across them in a hurried hand, vendors, delivery services, some familiar, some shadowed. Meanwhile, Jameson asked for another off-menu dish, his voice firm but polite, his eyes watching the twitch in Dale's jaw as the order filtered through the staff. He raised a toast to no one, laughed once too loudly, letting the room believe they were seeing arrogance when in truth they were watching bait. Every second of his performance gave Mara another heartbeat of cover. Every arrogant demand gave her another chance to slip through the cracks without notice. By the time dessert menus reached his table, the ballet was complete. Mara had woven service and subterfuge into one seamless rhythm, leaving behind no trace but the captured images in her phone, proof that the house of cards Dale had built was already trembling. Jameson lifted his fork, tasted nothing, and smiled faintly. The heist was not gold or jewels, but truth, stolen in plain sight under chandeliers, and it was more valuable than either. Jameson returned to the private room with the lanyard still around his neck, his face composed into the mask of entitlement the guests expected. He leaned back in the leather chair, waved for another glass of wine, and let the dining room watch him as if he were a spectacle put on for their amusement. The cameras hidden in corners would see a billionaire behaving like a man certain of his own importance, oblivious to the world around him. That was the part he had to play, and he played it well, his movements slow and deliberate, his expression carved from stone. Every so often he made a small demand, a dish reheated, a bottle replaced, a napkin folded twice instead of once, each request feeding the illusion that he was nothing more than a demanding guest. What the cameras could not see was that the real work was happening just beyond their reach. Mara carried trays with flawless timing, her steps a rhythm that blended with the hum of service, never hurried, never hesitant. To the guests, she was only a waitress with steady hands and polite words, but her mind moved with precision. Between serving courses, she slipped through the back corridors where Wren's small devices were already alive. A phone tucked deep in her apron captured images quickly, no flash, no sound. She photographed the slips of paper Dale kept in a drawer, half closed, names written with sloppy haste, figures circled and marked as VIP assurance adjustments. She scrolled through the register screen when Dale turned his back, snapping the forced comps with their false timestamps, proof of meals written off under a program that bled the house dry. At one point she paused by the wine locker, her tray resting against her hip as if she were waiting for a bottle. Her hand reached casually, pulling forward a crate just enough to reveal the envelopes stacked in the shadowed space. Each one bore a different vendor name. Some she knew, Some she did not, but all too clean, too identical, thick with cash that never touched the official ledgers. She slid the crate back in place and returned to the floor, her smile intact, her breathing steady. Guests thanked her, managers nodded, and no one saw the evidence now resting in the memory of her phone. Jameson, still visible, continued his role. He asked Dale about the menu with just enough arrogance to keep him occupied, feigned irritation at the pacing of dishes, and demanded a new pour of wine, though his glass was barely touched. Every word was meant to hold attention, to make him appear a distraction rather than a conspirator. The cameras would catch nothing unusual beyond the vanity of wealth, nothing worth blackmail that was not already expected of him. All the while, the true story was being carved in secret, file by file, image by image. By the time dessert was offered, the heist was complete. Mara returned to Jameson's table with hands steady and eyes calm, placing a perfect plate before him as if nothing had happened. He met her gaze for the briefest second, enough to signal that he understood the courage behind her calm. 2 tables had been served that night, one in plain sight, one in shadows, and together they had written the first chapter of Dale's downfall. The dining room glowed with the same soft light it always carried, polished silver catching the fire's reflection, glasses ringing with quiet laughter. But beneath the gleam, Jameson could sense the strain building. He had stayed long enough to see the rhythm of the house, how every smile came not from joy, but from calculation, and how every gesture bent to the invisible weight of money. He watched from his seat as a small conflict unfolded near the center of the room. Something most guests dismissed, but which caught his attention like a thread pulled from fine cloth. A young busser, barely out of his teens, was asked by the hostess to clear a table that was still occupied, a couple halfway through their meal, so that a hedge fund party could be seated in their place. The boy hesitated, clutching his tray, and shook his head. He whispered that it was wrong, that the couple had been waiting all week for this reservation, that it would humiliate them to be forced out mid-course. The hostess's smile hardened, her eyes flashing toward Dale Mercer, who stood at the bar. Dale crossed the floor with the swiftness of a man who enjoyed putting out fires, not with water, but with gasoline. He leaned down to the busser, his grin wide for the room to see, but his words sharp enough to cut. Within seconds, the boy's shoulders slumped, his face pale, and the tray nearly slipped from his hands. Dale straightened, still smiling, and gave the hostess a nod. The couple was quietly asked to move to a cramped table by the kitchen doors, their protest smothered with free dessert menus, while the hedge fund party was ushered into their place as if they were royalty. The boy disappeared toward the back, his punishment already written in the set of Dale's jaw. Mara stood frozen for a heartbeat, her jaw tight, her knuckles whitening around the stem of a wine glass she was polishing. Jameson saw it, the tiny fracture in her calm, and he understood. This was the price of deference, the toll exacted by a culture that worshipped profit above dignity. He thought of the hours stolen through falsified overtime, the envelopes of cash tucked away in the wine locker, and now he saw the cost measured not only in money, but in human spirit. Staff were taught to betray fairness for the sake of appearances, to trade kindness for currency, to bend until something in them broke. Jameson shifted in his chair, his expression never changing, but his mind sharpened with the cold precision of a blade. He had built his empire to stand for excellence, but here excellence had been replaced by servitude dressed in silk. He watched Mara take a deep breath and return to service, her face once again composed, but the tremor in her jaw told him everything he needed to know. For her, for the boy, for all the quiet souls forced to sell dignity piece by piece, he felt the fury settle deep in his chest. He raised his glass, hiding the pale burn in his eyes, and drank, tasting not wine, but the bitterness of a house poisoned by its own worship of wealth. The night slowed as the last of the guests lingered over their coffee, the hum of the dining room thinning into silence. But Mara felt her pulse quicken when Dale motioned for her to follow. She knew that smile, the one that curved too wide across his face like a blade waiting to cut, and every instinct told her to stay away. Still she obeyed, because refusing him would only make the cut deeper. He led her toward the manager's office at the back, his polished shoes clicking against the tiles, his voice carrying just enough cheer to mask the steel beneath it. Inside, he closed the door with a soft click, leaned against the desk, and folded his arms as if the room belonged to him alone. His smile never faded, but his eyes sharpened. Mara stood near the wall, her tray still in her hands like a shield, her breath steady though her chest ached. "You've been busy tonight," Dale said, his tone light but laced with something darker. "Talking to the wrong people, maybe?" He tilted his head, studying her the way a predator studies prey. Mara said nothing, only lowered her gaze to the tray as if she were embarrassed, but inside her heart slammed against her ribs. Dale stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You know, schedules are fragile things. Shifts can vanish, hours can dry up, and before long even good workers find themselves without a place. A shame, really, especially for someone with bills to pay." His smile cut sharper, the switchblade hidden in plain sight, a grin wide enough to fool anyone walking past, but cruel enough to strip her to the bone. Mara forced her voice to stay calm. "I have only done my job," she said, each word careful, each syllable weighed. Dale chuckled, shaking his head as though amused by her courage. "That's what Finch's girls used to say, and look where it got them." He leaned so close she could smell the bitter coffee on his breath. "You'd better remember who runs this house now." He tapped the desk lightly, a rhythm that sounded like a warning drumbeat. Mara gripped the tray tighter, her nails pressing into the wood. But she did not break. She let silence answer him, because silence was safer than words. Above them, unseen, Wren crouched by the vent that overlooked the office. Her small recorder already hummed, but now she angled the tiny microphone she had planted earlier, every word slipping into its memory with crisp clarity. Her expression was flat, professional, but inside she felt a grim satisfaction. Dale was burying himself with every syllable, his arrogance blinding him to the eyes and ears now woven into the walls. She caught every threat, every hint of coercion, every note of menace hiding in his sing-song voice. When Dale finally dismissed Mara with a lazy wave, telling her to keep her head down if she valued her schedule, she left the room with her back straight, her face unreadable. Wren remained still above, her recorder filled with proof, the kind that turned smiles into shackles. Jameson would have what he needed now, not rumor, but evidence, captured through the vent where Dale had believed himself untouchable. The last guests drifted out into the night, leaving the Gilded Steer quieter than a church after Mass, the faint smell of wine and roasted meat still clinging to the air. Staff moved quickly through the usual closing routine, stacking chairs, wiping tables, rolling silverware into napkins, their voices hushed with fatigue. Mara moved among them with her steady rhythm, though her chest still held the echo of Dale's threats. Jameson waited in the private room, the badge still hanging around his neck, his expression carved from calm stone. The moment the final lights in the dining room dimmed, the real work began. From the back corridor, Arthur Pendleton appeared, his suit immaculate even at this late hour, his presence quiet but commanding. Beside him, Wren emerged with her sparkle-clean cart, and two men followed, nondescript in dark jackets, their movements smooth, their eyes sharp. Agents, silent and certain, their purpose clear without a word spoken. Dale had retreated to his office, humming to himself, thinking the night his to control. He did not see the shadows moving closer, did not hear the soft click of Wren's device bypassing the keypad lock on his door. When the handle turned and the office opened, he looked up in surprise, his mouth half forming a protest, but Arthur's voice cut through the air with quiet authority. "Sit down." Dale's grin faltered, the arrogance in his eyes flickering to something smaller, though he forced a laugh to cover it. "Of course, gentlemen, must be some misunderstanding." But no one answered. Wren was already at the bookshelf, her fingers pressing against the edges until the hidden safe revealed itself, small and smug behind trophies and binders. She set down her tools, her hands steady, her eyes cold. Within minutes the tumblers yielded, the lock gave way, and the safe opened with a dull sigh. Inside lay the truth. Stacks of thin ledgers bound in black leather, their pages filled with the names of vendors, numbers twisted into false generosity, and lines rerouted under the glowing title VIP Assurance. Wren pulled one free, flipping pages under the lens of a small camera, capturing everything. Beneath them rested envelopes of non-disclosure agreements, signatures blank, dates empty, ready to be filled whenever silence needed to be bought. Some carried faint stains, as if they had already been used in darker rooms. At the very bottom sat a single laminated sheet, neat columns typed in cold clarity, a menu of problem-solving rates. Each line carried a price, small enough to slip through accounts unnoticed, large enough to ruin a life. Handle a complaint, 5,000. Relocate a staff member, 10. Quiet a scandal, 20. Jameson read it once, then set it on the desk with deliberate care, his face pale with fury. Dale tried to protest, words tumbling out about loyalty, about how Finch had left a mess, about how he had only done what was needed. No one responded. The agents simply watched, their presence heavy, while Wren closed the safe and Arthur tucked the ledger beneath his arm. Lights had come on at last, not the golden glow of the dining room, but the harsh white of truth. And in that light, Dale Mercer's smile, so sharp and so polished, finally broke. The morning light spilled through the tall windows of the Gilded Steer, turning the polished floors into a mirror that reflected the tired faces of the staff gathered in uneasy silence. Word had spread quickly that the owner himself was in the building, not as a ghost hidden in thrift store clothes, but as Jameson Blackwood, dressed in a suit that seemed carved from authority. Dale Mercer was gone, escorted out under the watch of men who did not smile, and the absence of his shadow left the room raw with questions. Jameson stepped forward, his expression steady, his voice calm but carrying the weight of something final. He looked at the faces before him, waiters with dark circles under their eyes, bussers shifting nervously, cooks still smelling faintly of smoke from the grills, and he let the silence stretch before he spoke. He began by admitting what no one expected to hear. "Power distorts rooms," he said, "and I am not blind to the fact that my presence has twisted this one. You have been told to bend, to bow, to smile brighter when wealth walks in, and that culture is mine to own because it grew under my name." The words fell heavy, and some heads lowered, not in shame but in disbelief that a man like him could acknowledge what they all knew, but never dared to say aloud. Jameson continued, his voice softer now but sharp with intent. "Last night I tested this house, and what I saw was not excellence. It was fear dressed as service. That ends today." He announced the immediate dismantling of the VIP Assurance program, his words crisp and final. No more comped bills hidden under false generosity, no more forced smiles at the expense of dignity, No more guests treated as gods while others were pushed aside like furniture. The staff shifted, glances passed between them, some skeptical, some hopeful, all uncertain. Then he laid down the second decree. Every hour of stolen labor would be repaid in full, every falsified sheet corrected, and restitution delivered directly to the workers whose time had been erased. The shock rippled through the crowd, and Mara, standing at the back, felt her chest tighten as if she had been holding her breath for months. Finally, Jameson set the rule that cut deeper than all the rest. "No guest," he said, "outranks safety or staff dignity. Not a hedge fund party, not a councilman, not even me." The words landed like stones in a still pond, sending quiet waves through every corner of the room. For a long moment no one moved, as if waiting for the catch, the condition, the twist, but none came. Jameson simply stood there, his hands at his sides, his gaze unwavering, and let the silence speak for him. Then, slowly, the room shifted. A busser straightened his shoulders. A cook lifted his head. Mara felt the knot in her jaw loosen. The Gilded Steer had been built on performance, but for the first time in years, the staff were not actors on a stage. They were people, seen and acknowledged, their dignity restored not by favor, but by rule. And in that moment, the repair began. The announcement settled over the staff like a tide turning, disbelief mingling with relief. But Jameson did not leave the room with only words behind him. He turned his gaze toward Mara, the young woman whose calm had steadied him through the storm, whose courage had exposed the ledger behind Dale's smile. She stood with her tray still in hand, her uniform plain, her shoes worn, her face unreadable, though her eyes held the weight of nights too long and choices too hard. Jameson called her forward, his tone gentler now, the authority in his voice balanced with respect. He told the staff that what had been uncovered, what had been repaired, began not with a report or an audit, but with honesty, with one employee who chose to protect dignity, even when it cost her comfort. Then he offered what none of them expected, a position created that morning and named for her example, Director of Guest Ethics, a role tasked with guarding fairness on the floor, ensuring that no guest would ever outrank the humanity of those who served them. Mara blinked as if the words were foreign, her lips parting but no sound coming, her mind struggling to stretch around the idea that the girl who polished glasses and balanced plates could now be trusted with such power. She whispered that she was only a waitress, only doing what was right, but Jameson shook his head. "Integrity is not small," he said, "and those who carry it quietly often deserve the loudest place at the table." The staff looked on, their faces lit with something new, something closer to hope, as Mara accepted with a nod, her voice barely steady as she said, "Yes." Jameson did not linger in the place of authority. He stepped away from the front, walked back into the dining room, and chose a plain table near the kitchen doors, the same kind of table where guests had once been pushed when they were judged unworthy of the main floor. He sat down without ceremony, removed the badge still hanging from his neck, and placed it on the table where everyone could see. When a server approached, nervous and uncertain, he asked only for water. No wine, no emperor's cut, no spectacle, only water. Then he leaned back, his hands folded, and began to listen. He listened to the staff cleaning, their voices lighter now, their laughter beginning to return. He listened to the silence in the corners where fear had once lived. He listened as the house itself seemed to exhale. Mara, still holding her tray, walked through the room with her usual steady pace, but now her eyes lifted higher, her steps firmer. The staff moved differently too, not bowed but upright, their shoulders eased, their smiles less forced. The word employee, once a tool of control, had changed shape. It no longer meant someone to be bent or threatened. It meant every person here mattered, that dignity was the foundation of service, not a casualty of it. Jameson took a slow sip of water and let the truth settle inside him. For the first time in years, the house breathed, and so did he. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.